I just want to read a few lines about Dr. Ben Carson. His full name is Benjamin Solomon Ben Carson, Sr. He is a retired, I was very sad to learn that he recently retired from neurosurgery, retired American neurosurgeon. Among other surgical innovations, Carson did pioneering work on the successful separation of conjoined twins joined at the head. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States, by then President George Walker Bush. Good morning to you, Dr. Carson.
Thank you so much for being here. The first question we have here, I asked some people what they wanna ask you, and they say they have 5 tips for being successful in life. What 5 tips you can give us?
Okay, well, first tip is figure out what you're good at. You know, everybody's particularly good at something because God gives you gifts. So get in contact with that. The next thing is be honest. Learn to be honest because it makes all the difference in the world. Once you start being dishonest, it begets another lie, and then it complicates your life. The third tip is be nice to other people. You know, treat other people the way that you want to be treated. And it makes all the difference in the world. Become extremely knowledgeable. Program that computer of yours, which God has given you. And most importantly, make sure you have the relationship with God, because that's more important than anything else in the world.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, the Seventh-day Adventist World Church has decided to be apolitical. What role does the church have, if at all, to play in global politics?
Well, you know, whether something is political or not is a matter of opinion. A lot of people think that, you know, I'm political, but I'm not. I tend to cling to the things that God has said are right. And that makes you political in some cases because you're not necessarily going along with the flow. Go along to get along. And Jesus, I guess, was considered political too, because he didn't necessarily go along with everything that was going on. He had principles and values. And the fact of the matter is, we're told that if you have principles and values that you live by, it will create controversy, it will create problems. And if you're somebody who gets along well with everybody and never has a problem, then there's a good chance that you don't stand for anything.
Great. So you think the world can be better, and how?
What
the
now?
world.
The world?
Yeah, can be better, and how?
How can the world be made better? Well, the best thing that we each can do in our own spheres to make the world better is to lead a life that exemplifies a relationship with God. Because that means that you treat other people the right way. You know, when they become nasty and irresponsible, you don't become nasty and irresponsible in response to that. Instead, you show them the different way. And if you do that, it will have an impact over the course of time.
Is the Seventh-day Adventist Church effective at its enterprise to preach the gospel of Jesus to all the world in this generation?
Well, the Adventist Church is a very good mechanism for doing it, because one of the things about the Adventist Church is that we believe in the entirety of God's Word. We don't pick and choose one part and say, well, now that part's irrelevant and this part we'll take. And I think that makes us a particularly good example. And also, you look at our name, Seventh-day Adventist. That means that we believe in the literal seventh-day creation. We believe that God is supreme, and we believe that he is coming back again, and we lead our lives that way.
And what role can we as Adventist youth play in all this preaching and all this evangelism?
Well, the role that we can play is to make ourselves knowledgeable. You have to know about all cultures, have to know about all aspects in order to be able to preach in order to be able to teach people in a way that's relevant to them. If you only come at things from one direction because you only know one direction, then you're going to be much more limited. So we have a responsibility to learn about other people.
Parting shot. Often we wish we could hear the voice of God. We would wish to hear God speaking to us. You also said, when asked whether you're running for president, that you will wait for God to speak to you. Michelle Bachmann was mocked when she said that. So have you ever heard the voice of God before? And what would you advise us to do so that we too can hear the voice of God?
God speaks to people in lots of different ways. I don't think there's any one particular way that he speaks to people. And one of the ways is by giving you wisdom. One of the ways is by opening doors and closing doors. I remember when, I finished my residency at Johns Hopkins, and I was invited to come to Australia to be the senior registrar at the major teaching hospital in Western Australia. And I said, Australia? Are you kidding me? That's not what I said to the guy. But that's what I was thinking. I mean, in Baltimore, if you drill a hole all the way through the earth, you come out in Australia. I didn't want to go over there. And plus, they had some policies and things. And I said, I don't want to go to Australia. But then it seemed like every time I turned around, there was somebody saying, "Good day, mate. How you doing?" I kept running into Australians everywhere. And every time we turned the TV on, there was a special about Australia. And I said to my wife, I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia. And so, we sold all of our earthly belongings, and off we went to Australia. And our friends were saying, "You'll be back in 3 weeks." But little did they know we didn't have any more money, so we couldn't come back anyway. But, but the biggest problem we had in Australia was keeping up with all the dinner invitations. Everybody's always inviting you out to dinner. And probably the second biggest problem I had is every time I sat down and started writing in a chart, somebody would come up and say, "Do you mind if I feel your hair?" So I would say, "You can fill it, but it's going to cost you $10. But it turned out to be absolutely a wonderful experience because there were only 4 neurosurgery consultants in all of Western Australia. And once they discovered that I knew how to operate, they went to the private hospitals and left me in charge of the major teaching hospital. So I was doing 3 or 4 craniotomies every day. I got an enormous amount of experience. So when I came back to the United States and joined the faculty at Hopkins, and the position opened up for director of pediatric neurosurgery, even though I was only 33 years old, they said, "Well, Carson's very young, but he's got all this experience, so we're going to make him the chief." And that was the way that the Lord opened the door and created the right responsibility and opportunity for me. And that's one of the ways that he speaks to you. You have to be willing to recognize those things and take those opportunities. So when it comes to politics for me, I don't have any desire, for national office. But if that's the way the Lord leads, it will become clear.
Dr.
Thank you
Hoffman,
very much.
thank you very much for talking to us here.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Carson.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, my wife and I are delighted to be here and to see all the enthusiastic, bright young faces from all over the world. And I wanted to talk a little bit this morning about dreaming. One of my favorite characters in the Bible was Joseph. And here was a guy who had some pretty interesting dreams about what was going to happen, and everybody bowing down to him and stuff like that. His mistake was that he expressed those dreams. He probably should have just kept his dreams to himself. But he had those dreams, and of course, it created a lot of animosity amongst his brethren, and they became very jealous, and they actually sold him into slavery. Now, here was the interesting thing about Joseph. His own brothers sold him into slavery. But did he get upset? Did he say, bummer, my own brother sold me into slavery, life is over? No. He said, if I'm going to be a slave, I'll be the best slave there is. And in no time, he was promoted to chief of Potiphar's household, the captain of the Egyptian guard. A tremendous amount of responsibility. But then, Potiphar's wife said, wow, this is a good-looking guy. Whoa, I think I want to deal with him. But, he had principles. And there was no way that he was going to allow himself to be tempted. And as a result of that, he ended up being thrown into prison. Now, what you have to remember is, if Potiphar had really thought that he was guilty of what his wife said, he would have been killed. Okay, so Potiphar knew good and well that Joseph had not made advances on his wife. But, he didn't want his wife to be embarrassed, so, he went along with the program and had Joseph thrown into prison. Interestingly enough, Joseph didn't say, here I am living up to my principles and my values, and what do I get? Thrown into prison. No, he said, if I'm going to be a prisoner, I'll be the best prisoner there is. And he ends up with a responsible position in the prison, starts interpreting dreams. The next thing you know, he's the governor of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And interestingly enough, did you ever stop and think about it? Now, he was over Potiphar. But did he seek revenge? Did he seek revenge against Potiphar? Of course not. He said, forget about it. Not a problem. But it shows that it really doesn't matter where you are in life. Doesn't matter how low a position you have. If you connect yourself with the ultimate source of power in the universe, anything can happen. So it's okay to have that dream. And as a youngster, I had a dream of becoming a doctor. I used to listen to those stories, the mission stories in church and Sabbath school. Frequently featured missionary doctors. They seemed like the most noble people on earth, traveling all over the world to bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people. I said, there's nothing more noble that a person can do. So when I was 8 years old, I said, I'm going to be a missionary doctor. And that was my dream until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out, and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV, they seemed like rich people. They drove Jaguars, and they had the fancy mansions, and they had these big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems, and I would sit them down and stroke my chin. Tell me about your mama. And and I majored in psychology in college, and I did advanced psych in medical school, and I was gung-ho. I was all ready to be a psychiatrist. And then I started running into a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? But now, actually, some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I discovered very quickly is that what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. They're actually some of the more intellectual members of the medical community. But it really wasn't what I wanted to do. So now I started thinking, God gives everybody special gifts and talents. And I said, what are your special gifts and talents? And this is a very important question for young people to ask themselves. And as I started thinking back through my life, I realized that I had a lot of eye-hand coordination and the ability to think in 3 dimensions, that I was a very careful person. I never knocked things over and said, oops, which is a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things. And I remember when when I was a youngster, before we became vegetarians, you know, whenever there was meat on the plate, I would have my knife and fork, and I would be dissecting out the little neurovascular bundles and the fascial planes. I want to eat that, and I put that over here. So I had a lot of experience dissecting things. And so I started thinking about that. Plus, I loved the human brain. And all those years I was thinking I was going to be a psychiatrist. So I put all that together and I said, brain surgeon. You should become a brain surgeon. And a lot of people thought that was a strange idea. At that time, there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. And they thought that was really a strange idea for me. But to me, it seemed like just the most natural thing that I could do. And, you know, you really don't have to worry about what has been or what has not been. What you need to worry about is what the Lord has prepared you to do. And you use the talent that he has given you. And even if it's something that nobody has done before, you know, nobody has done anything until somebody does it. So, you know, you may be the person who God has chosen to be the one to do something. So don't limit yourself on the basis of what somebody else has done in the past. Well, obviously there were a lot of obstacles along the way to me achieving my dream. You know, the fact that my parents got divorced, the fact that we lived in dire poverty. You know, these kinds of things, if you take hold of them and you allow them to control your life, they will control your life. And I remember, you know, the fact that we had no money for anything, ever. And my mother would go out and work 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time, trying to make ends meet because she didn't want to be on welfare. And I remember when I was 9 years old, sitting on the steps in the ghetto, looking through the building across the street. All the windows were broken out, and you could see the sun shining all the way through the building. And thinking that I probably would never live to be more than 25 years of age. Because that's what I saw around me. Both of my older cousins, who we adored, were killed. I saw people being killed all the time. But, you know, I still, even at that time, believed that somehow I could become a doctor. And, you know, interestingly enough, life went on. You know, I started becoming a better student. Things worked out extraordinarily well. And I ended up at Yale University. And I must admit that I thought I was pretty smart. I mean, here I was, poor kid, came through the ghetto, got a scholarship to Yale University. I thought I was really, really smart. But by the end of that first semester, I had a very different opinion of myself because I was doing extremely poorly, and especially in chemistry. And I was pre-med. So obviously you have to do well in chemistry if you're pre-med. And I was going to fail. I hadn't even a chance of passing. Even if I got an A on the final exam, I was still going to fail. That's how bad it was. But the professor, in his kindness, or in his sadism, I'm not sure which, he said, for all those students who are failing, I will give you double credit on your final exam. So if you get an A, you could get a good mark. Now, everybody knows there's no chance they were going to get an A, but, you know, he was saying that anyway to give you that last glimmer of hope before you went down. And so there I was, you know, the last night before the final, and I'm thinking, you know, Lord, I always thought you wanted me to be a doctor. It's the only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was 8 years old. And now it looks like I'm going to fail chemistry, so there's no way I'm getting into medical school. So would you please tell me what it is that you really want me to do? or alternatively and preferably work a miracle. And as I picked up that chemistry book, I'm thinking, how am I going to learn all of this in one night? But I'm going to try. So I sat down and I started going through page after page, and of course, it wasn't long before I fell asleep. And I dreamed I was in a large auditorium. Just me, I was the only one in the auditorium except for the professor who was writing out chemistry problems and their solutions, and I was writing them down. And then I awakened very early that morning. And I got ready, and I went in for the exam, feeling that there was no chance of passing. And when I opened up the final exam book and I looked at the first problem, I was flabbergasted because it was one of the problems I had dreamed about. So I knew the answer. And I wrote it down, and I turned the page, and I said, oh, wow, that's one of the other ones I dreamed about. And that all the way through the exam, I was one of the first people out of the exam. And I got a very good mark on the exam. Why not? I had just seen it the night before. But, at that point, I truly realized, I said, Lord, I know you want me to be a physician. I know there's something you want me to do. And I am going to become a serious student now. You're not going to ever have to do this for me again. And I did learn how to study significantly at that point. I still had some little things that I did that I probably shouldn't have done, but it was better. And I did well enough. I got into medical school at the University of Michigan. And now I was really feeling all the obstacles around the way. Well, then came the first set of comprehensive exams, 6 weeks into the first year. I did terribly on the first set of comprehensive exams. And I was sent to see my counselor. This is the person the university chooses to help you get through medical school. And he looked at my record and he says, you seem like a very intelligent young man. I bet there are a lot of things you could do outside of medicine. He tried to convince me to drop out of medical school. He says, you're not cut out for medicine. You're just going to torment yourself and everybody else. So why don't you get out? We'll help you get into another area so you won't have wasted a year. That seemed like a very kind thing, but it was devastating to me. The only thing I'd ever wanted to do since I was 8. And here I am finally in medical school, and the counselor tells me to drop out. So I went back to my apartment, and I prayed. I said, Lord, I just don't understand. Here I am doing what I thought you wanted me to do. Things are not working out. My counselor thinks I should drop out. What should I do? And then it just dawned on me. Analysis. That's why we have these big brains with these big frontal lobes, so we can analyze, not so that we can just drift through life. And I said, well, what kind of courses have you always done very well in? And what kind of courses have you struggled in? And what are the commonalities? What are the differences? And as I analyzed courses over the years, I said, you tend to do very well in courses where you do a lot of reading. And you tend to struggle in courses where you listen to a lot of boring lectures. Because I don't get anything out of boring lectures. It's just a total waste of my time. There I was listening to 6 to 8 hours worth of boring lectures every day. So basically wasting 6 to 8 hours a day. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And I remember some years later going back to my medical school as a commencement speaker, and I was looking for that counselor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor because some people are just negative. They're negative, negative, negative. They can always tell you why something won't work, but they never seem to be able to tell you how something does work. And I think that that's one of our roles. Wherever we are, we all have spheres of influence. And we all run into people who are discouraged. And if we invest a little bit of our time, a little bit of our effort in analyzing, once again, using those big brains, a lot of the times we can encourage them. We can give them steps that will help them to be successful. And I think that's a huge part of what Christianity is all about, a huge part of what Christ did himself, and it made all the difference in the world. Well, interestingly enough, when I decided in medical school toward the end of my first year that I was going to be a neurosurgeon, I had to ask myself, I said, I thought you were going to be a missionary doctor. And missionary doctors have an opportunity to impact a lot of people and to do good things for them, not only physically but mentally and spiritually. But neurosurgeons, they just operate, or they do things in their laboratories, and they do things in their societies, but they don't have any outreach. I said, Lord, are you sure that this is the path that I should be taking? Because if I become a neurosurgeon, I'll have no impact on the rest of the world for the rest of my life. And yet, I felt that neurosurgery was what he was calling me to be, regardless of that. And when I finished my training, I had to make a decision. Was I going to go into private practice and make a ton of money? Or was I going to stay in academic medicine and teach and research and not make a ton of money? And I must say, the idea of making a ton of money appealed to me more than not making a ton of money. But everything that was happening was pulling me in the direction of academics. When I went into the laboratory, I was supposed to be in the laboratory for 2 years. We had a defined project that I was supposed to do. We finished that project in 6 months. So a year and a half early, and everything just seemed to be pointing me in the direction of academics. So finally I just said, okay, I'll go and I'll stay in academics. I wasn't happy about it, but it just seemed like what he wanted me to do. But there I was at age 33, appointed director of pediatric neurosurgery at the famous Johns Hopkins Hospital. And again, I was thinking, wow, that must be really smart. There's something really special about me. And that I can do all of these things. Wow, this is just amazing. But that is until one particular case. This little boy, very, very smart young man, already repeating Bible verses by the time he was 2 years old. And but when he was 4, he started having a lot of problems. His eyes became disconjugate. They're looking in different directions. He started stumbling. He started having trouble breathing, trouble swallowing. And they diagnosed him with a brainstem tumor, a tumor in the part of the brain that is inoperable, and had multiple medical consultations. Nobody thought there was anything that could be done. They even went to faith healers. Nobody could help this kid. And he ended up at Johns Hopkins. And I remember seeing that little boy roll into the ward on that stretcher, saliva running out of his mouth, and his eyes crossed, barely moving, barely breathing. And I was thinking, what am I supposed to do here? And the parent said, Doctor, we prayed, and the Lord directed us here because we would find a neurosurgeon who could help our son. And the Lord told us that he's going to heal our son, and he's going to use you to do it. And I looked at the scans, and I said, but this is a brainstem tumor. There's nothing that I or anybody can do about this. This is an inoperable tumor. And they said, but doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son. He's going to use you to do it. And I said, look, I'll tell you what. MRIs were just new at that time. They were just coming out. I said, let's get an MRI. Maybe it'll show us something different than the CAT scan. And we got an MRI, and it looked just the same. And I showed it to all the neuroradiologists, and they all said the same thing. It's a brainstem tumor, nothing to be done. And I came back, and I said, I'm sorry. We've studied this. I've asked opinions of all the experts. Everybody says it's a brainstem tumor, nothing to be done. And they said, but doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son. I said, I'll tell you what. Every now and then, it's very rare. Every now and then, they make a mistake in reading these things. So what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll biopsy this, see if it's maybe something different than we think. So, I took him to the operating room, opened his head up, went down to the brain stem. There was this ugly reddish-gray tumor. And I took a biopsy, sent it off to the pathologist, and it came back as a high-grade glioma, a very malignant tumor. And while I was there, I just said, well, I'll just debulk. I'll just take some of it out to make some space until I started running across vital vessels and cranial nerves. And then I said, let's stop. And we closed it up. And I went out to talk to the parents, and I said, it's what we thought it was. I'm sorry. And, there's really not much that we can do about this. And, we'll understand it better by and by. God knows how things work. And, maybe he's already served his purpose in life. The kind of stuff we always tell people. Fully expecting that he was going to deteriorate and die. But over the course of the next few days, he started handling his secretions. His eyes started looking in the same direction. I said, wait a minute, what's going on here? I said, let's do another MRI. And we did. And there was still a big ugly tumor there, but you could see just a little ribbon of tissue off to the side. And I said, is it possible that maybe this wasn't in the brainstem? Maybe it was outside and it was just so big it was crushing everything so you couldn't see the brainstem? And maybe we should go back in. And they said, by all means. And I went back in, and the whole nature of the tumor was different. And I started peeling it away layer by layer. When I got to the last layer, there was the brainstem, completely intact, squished, but intact. We took it out. Make a long story short, that boy walked out of the hospital. And my wife and I actually saw him and his parents in Atlanta a couple of months ago. He is now a minister. So it is interesting. It is interesting. But one of the oncologists involved in that case came to me and he said, Ben, I've always been an atheist, but you know what? I'm a believer now. So, but it was really for me because I thought that I was this great neurosurgeon who was doing all these things. But after that case, I realized that it was God who was doing all these things. It wasn't me at all. And I said, you know what, Lord? You be the neurosurgeon. I'll be the hands. And that's why I called it gifted hands. It was a gift from him, And it was really after that all kinds of just amazing things began to happen. And, I became, I think, a part of other people's dreams. People who felt that there was no hope for anything. And they would end up with me. They would pray. They would seek their dream. And somehow God would use that opportunity. When I think about the first set of conjoined twins, I had gotten extremely interested in the whole concept of conjoined twins. And I started reading a lot of the literature, and I was trying to figure out why, with all the knowledge that we have, are we unsuccessful in separating those twins that are complexly joined at the head. And I concluded that it was primarily exsanguination or bleeding to death, because there was just no way to control all of that blood and air getting into the system and clogging things up. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins. I said, when you guys operate on little babies' hearts, how do you keep them from bleeding out? And he says, well, we use hypothermic arrest. We cool the body temperature until the heart stops, pump all the blood out of the body, and then we can operate for up to an hour before we have to warm the blood up, pump it back in, and start the hearts back up. And I said, wow, that's pretty cool. And I said, boy, if we could use that at a critical time when we were separating twins, it could conceivably work. And then I said, why am I thinking about this? I'm never going to see a set of twins like that. Why am I bothering myself about this? Lo and behold, 2 months later, here came these German doctors presenting this case to medical centers all over the world to see if anybody could come up with a way to separate those twins and keep them both alive, because in Europe, the doctors had recommended to the mother that she choose which twin she wanted, and they would basically chop the other one off. And she just couldn't do that. She just could not do that. So I explained to everybody this thing that I had been thinking about, and everybody said, wow, that sounds like it might work. And, I was fortunate that I was at Hopkins, where we have a lot of expertise in lots of different areas, and we started putting together a team. We started practicing, and lo and behold, 5 months later, we brought the twins there. We used the hypothermic arrest. It actually worked. And that was the first and only time that twins joined at the back of the head had ever been separated successfully. But in thinking about it, the Lord had prepared me for that beforehand. I didn't know why I had gotten so interested in that. And this is the thing about God. He never asks you to do something without preparing you first. And what we have to do is be willing to listen to his leadings. I have decided that it was time for me to retire from neurosurgery. People had told me that neurosurgeons die early. And I didn't necessarily believe that. So I wrote down the names of the 10 last neurosurgeons that I knew who died. And I averaged up the average age of death, and it was 61. Well, I'm 61 now. And I said, I don't want to die in the saddle. But more importantly, I felt pulled in other directions. I was fascinated when I was asked to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast. And the reason I was so fascinated is because I had spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in 1997 when Bill Clinton was president. And, it was very good. And I said, wait a minute, don't you guys know that I spoke in 1997? I said, has anybody ever spoken twice at the National Prayer Breakfast? And they said, one person has. And I said, who was that? And they said, Billy Graham. And I said, well, wow, that's pretty good company. And I felt that there must be a reason that the Lord wanted me to speak there. And, I just prayed and I said, Lord, I don't know exactly why you want me to speak there, but obviously you have a reason. And please tell me what it is you want me to say. Well, he did. He gave it to me, but it wasn't until the morning of the prayer breakfast. And, they kept saying, we want to see what you're going to say. Give us the text. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to say, so I can't give you the text. But, when I went out there, I really felt strongly that here was a national platform and an opportunity to talk about the spiritual state of the United States. And what fairness was truly all about, and about some of the principles like freedom of speech and freedom of expression that were being suppressed by political correctness, and by God's definition of fairness, and how he thought that proportionality is fair. And once you put that into the hands of man, then you get all kinds of aberrations in terms of interpretations. And that the importance of being modest, of being humble, particularly with our leaderships, and the importance of people working together, even when they have differences of opinion. And I had no idea that it was going to have such resonance with people across the nation. And really, I've heard it's had really quite an impact in many other countries as well. And a lot of people thought that I should be fearful because I was challenging the establishment. But you know what? I read the Bible. And in the 8th chapter of Romans, in the 31st verse, it says, if God be for you, who can be against you? And you know, you don't really have to worry about what anybody else says or what anybody else does when the Lord is working on your behalf. And you know, this applies to anything that you're doing. You have to have trust. You have to believe that God is truly behind you. You know, I remember in an area completely outside of medicine, several years ago, we had decided that we wanted to move. We had built the house that we thought was our dream house, and that was a house that we were going to live in for the rest of our lives. And it was sort of out in a rural area, and we really liked, you know, open space and rural areas. And then all the farmers around there started selling their farms and putting in all these developments. All of a sudden, there was nothing but developments everywhere. And I said, oh, this is not what we bargained for. So we decided to move. And we bought another house way out in the country with lots of land, and we owned the land, so there was nothing that anybody could do to encroach upon us again. But we put the other house up for sale, and it wouldn't sell. And every time somebody would bring in a contract and look like it was going to work, and at the last minute it would fall through. And it was a beautiful house, and houses were selling. It was during the housing bubble. Prices were going up, and we just couldn't figure out. I said, Lord, I pay my tithe, I'm faithful, and here you have me paying 2 mortgages. I don't understand. Why are you doing this to me? You know. And then I have a friend, a very, very close friend, who's a real estate mogul, and he had been trying to find some real estate investment property for me. And he said, but for you, it has to be perfect, the perfect thing. So he'd been looking for years. And then I have another friend who told me about something called a 1031 exchange, where if you sell a property and you make excessive profit on it, you switch the money over into another property that's more expensive, and you don't have to pay excessive taxes on it. But it has to be done within a 45-day period. Well, interestingly enough, I found out about the 1031 exchange. My friend found a perfect property, and the house, which had been on the market for 5 years, sold, all within that 41-day period, for twice as much than we had put it on the market for before, because it was during the housing bubble and the prices were going up. And if it had sold when we wanted to sell it, we would have never made that much profit on it. So here's my point. When the Lord says, I will bless you if you're faithful to me, a lot of times we say, I don't see how you're blessing me, Lord. What's happening? It's only because we can only see what's in front of us. He's able to see years down the road. And what we have to do is just trust him. No matter what's going on, no matter what it looks like, just recognize that the Lord has your best interest in mind. As long as you are doing those things that he has asked you to do. And, in terms of being parts of people's dreams, there was one last case I'm going to tell you about. And this was a case of a young man who had Van Hippel-Lindau's disease. And this is a genetic disorder, something we call a neurophacomatosis. And they develop tumors, and particularly tumors in the eye, tumors in the brain. Well, he developed one right in the pons, in the middle of the brainstem. And, none of the adult neurosurgeons would operate on him because it was basically a death sentence. His wife was a nurse on the pediatric neurosurgery service. And she came to me and she said, my husband has this tumor in the pons and none of the adult guys will operate on him, but you do all kinds of amazing things. You should operate on him. I said, but he's an adult. And she said, well, he's a kid at heart. And, I said, do you realize that, there's a 50-50 chance he'll die on the table? She says, I do realize that, but would you at least talk to him? So I went and talked to him. And I said, Craig, I understand, the situation. He was just kind of laying there. He could barely talk. He was so compromised. And I said, this is essentially an inoperable situation. This is in the middle of your pons. And I said, if I operate on this, there's at least a 50-50 chance that you will die on the table. And he says, Doc, if you don't operate on it, there's a 100% chance that I'm going to die. So I'll take 50 any day. And I said, you know what? He's got the right attitude. So I went in and operated on this thing. I got down to the brainstem. There were all these abnormal blood vessels all over everything. I made my way through and got to a small area where I could open up an area in the brainstem and reach in with a little micro instrument, and I could feel the change in consistency, so I knew that was the lesion. And I started just pulling it, slowly pulling it. I could see the dark coloration. Took another little micro instrument, and I was just dissecting around it. You couldn't see, but you could feel. And as I was pulling it, the anesthesiologist said, the evoked potentials have gone flat. These are the little electrical waves to show you what's going on. And he says, you killed him. He says, I told you not to do this operation. And, we were not happy, needless to say, but I did finish pulling it out and close things up. It was a very somber mood. But his vital signs were okay. He sent him to the intensive care unit. And when I came in the next morning, he was sitting up in the bed cracking jokes. So a lot of the things, I have a lot of stories like that where, if you sit down and you look at things from a strictly medical, scientific point of view, you really can't explain them. But when you look at them from a spiritual point of view, you can explain them perfectly well. Because God is still alive. God is still active in our lives. What we frequently lack is faith. And, that's a topic that I'm going to talk about tomorrow afternoon, our lack of faith and how we develop faith. But interestingly enough, you remember I was telling you how when I decided that I was going to go into neurosurgery, I was thinking that neurosurgeons don't have any impact in the world. Well, I will say that the Lord changed that whole equation. And he gave me an opportunity to have much more impact through the books, through lectures, through television appearances, through magazine articles, through speaking all over the place. I'm probably the most popular speaker at the Washington Speakers Bureau. The Lord created all of that. The medical career that he was a platform. And as I said before, the Lord never asks you to do anything without first preparing you for it. So as a neurosurgeon, I got involved in a lot of very controversial issues, a lot of things that people thought could not be done. But the Lord showed me how to do those things. The Lord worked out a situation in which those things were possible to do. And I've come to learn that it really doesn't depend on me. It really depends on him. And that is something that is so important in every one of your lives. As young people, recognizing that yes, he has given you talent, but the most important thing that he's given you is the opportunity to be on his team. And when you're on his team, you're on a team that never loses. And this is what you have to remember. Think of it as a baseball team. And, only thing you know is that every time Jesus comes up to bat, he's going to hit a home run. It doesn't really matter whether you hit a home run or not. It matters whether you're on the team. And when you win the World Series, you get the World Series ring because you're on the team. If you leave the team, that's a different story. So all you have to do is remain on the team. If you strike out every single time, stay on the team. Recognize that he is going to bring you through. And that's what faith is all about. Thank you.